Imagine a narrow road cutting through marshland and forest, wrapped in the mist of late summer. On that road, a column of German tanks advances. They move with confidence, accustomed to breaking through defenses as easily as a blade through paper. For them, war has become a victorious march toward Leningrad, close, almost within reach. The engines rumble steadily, armor rattles, and no one expects anything ahead that could truly stop them. But in the woods, another sound waits in silence. A heavier machine, its steel cold and still. Inside, 5 men breathe slowly, tensely. Not heroes from legend, not fearless giants, just ordinary soldiers who understand one thing with absolute clarity: in a few moments, they will either carve their place into history or vanish beneath the earth of this same forest, swallowed by the fog. They have only one tank. One firing position. One chance. And that single chance is enough to halt an entire armored column. Enough to disrupt the tempo of the offensive. Enough to strike at blitzkrieg in its most vulnerable place, not in its armor or firepower, but in its certainty. In a few seconds, a single shot will shatter the rhythm of the battle. One shell will change the direction of the road. And one tank will prove that sometimes to defend a city, you do not need an army, you need only cold calculation, thick armor, and 5 men who cannot afford to make a single mistake. The tank engagement near Krasnogvardeysk on August 20, 1941, stands as one of the most clearly documented examples of extraordinary individual action by an armored crew during the Second World War. The historical record, supported by Soviet archival documents and post-war technical and battlefield evaluations, confirms that a single KV-1 heavy tank, commanded by Junior Lieutenant Zinovy Grigorievich Kolobanov, destroyed 22 enemy armored vehicles in a single battle and survived. Unlike many wartime anecdotes that have been subject to exaggeration, this event was recorded by formal after-action reports and supported by physical evidence observed shortly afterward. It occurred during one of the most decisive phases of the German advance on Leningrad, at a time when German armored spearheads were pushing aggressively toward the outskirts of the Soviet city. The engagement holds historical value not because it is a dramatic numerical achievement, but because it underscores the technical, tactical, and psychological dimensions of armored warfare within the larger context of the Eastern Front. The KV-1 used in the action was not merely a well-armored vehicle, it represented one of the few tools the Red Army possessed in the summer of 1941 that could resist German fire with consistency. When Germany launched Operation Barbarossa in June, most Soviet tank formations were poorly coordinated, lacked air support, and suffered from logistical chaos, mechanical failures, and officer shortages. Yet despite institutional problems, certain weapons within the arsenal of the Red Army were formidable. The KV-1, with its reinforced armor and adequate firepower for its weight category, was arguably one of the most resilient heavy tanks of the early war. German crews repeatedly described encounters with KV tanks as nearly insurmountable challenges before dedicated anti-tank artillery could be brought forward. In several documented cases, German 37mm anti-tank guns were incapable of penetrating the KV armor at normal engagement ranges. This limitation directly contributed to the significance of what would take place outside Leningrad in August 1941. Kolobanov's unit was assigned a defensive mission. Following rapid German advances toward Krasnogvardeysk, known after the war as Gachina, the Soviet command expected enemy armor to attempt an encirclement maneuver on the approaches to the city. The Germans, confident from weeks of success, had grown accustomed to encountering disorganized resistance. They did not expect a well-conceived defensive plan that would incorporate both terrain advantage and heavy armor. The wooded and marshy environment around the chosen blockade area restricted movement and made it difficult for mechanized columns to deviate from established routes. German armored spearheads depended on accessible roads. Soviet staff officers recognized this and issued orders to block several potential avenues of approach. Kolobanov, commanding a platoon of heavy tanks, was tasked with defending a key road junction leading toward Krasnogvardeysk. His orders were clear: stop any armored advance at this point, hold at all costs, and prevent German vehicles from reaching the city. Before the battle, Kolobanov conducted reconnaissance of the terrain. Observers in his platoon identified a narrow road, bordered by marshland and forest cover, which would force German columns into a confined formation. The KV-1 was positioned off the road at a hidden angle, dug into a hull-down state where only its turret would be visible. The crew camouflaged the tank and prepared firing positions. They also arranged for pre-selected target ranges, using reference markers visible through the commander's sight. Such preparations were not typical in the general disorder of the 1941 Soviet front, which makes this particular engagement unusual from a tactical standpoint. Kolobanov and his crew were not only relying on the strength of their vehicle, they were using terrain, concealment, and fire discipline to magnify their effectiveness. The enemy that approached the Soviet position belonged to the German 8th Panzer Division, which had been part of a larger group advancing from the direction of Estonia toward Leningrad via Pskov and Luga. The division had been engaged in continuous movement and combat for weeks. Although fatigued, German troops maintained confidence. Armored crews had little reason to fear individual Soviet tanks, since most Soviet vehicles encountered to that point had been outdated models engaged without effective tactical support. German tactical doctrine relied on coordination and speed, but such advantages could be neutralized by terrain and by an opponent capable of delivering precise, unexpected fire. As the German column advanced along the narrow roadway, it was composed of light and medium armored vehicles. These included Panzer 35T, tanks of Czech origin and Panzer IIIs. These vehicles were reliable and adequately armed for most encounters during the early invasion, but their armor was insufficient against concentrated heavy-caliber fire. The Soviet KV-1, with its 76 mm cannon, held superior penetration capability against these types. The Germans did not immediately detect the threat concealed within the woods, since the KV remained motionless and camouflaged. A column of tanks approached without opening fire or taking evasive action, assuming no significant resistance ahead. Their lack of anticipation demonstrates how critical situational knowledge and terrain assessment can be in armored combat, especially when facing a determined defensive force. When the leading German tanks entered the designated kill zone, Kolobanov gave the order to engage. The first shot destroyed the lead tank, blocking the road and halting the forward advance. A second shot struck the rear vehicle, locking the column into a confined space where maneuver was almost impossible. Once immobilization occurred, the KV-1 became the dominant weapon in a controlled environment. German crews attempted to return fire, but their shells either ricocheted or failed to penetrate the thick frontal armor of the Soviet turret. Accounts from after-action reports demonstrate that German crews continued to fire despite the obvious ineffectiveness, likely due to a combination of training and the stress of battle. In a column under fire, crews could not easily withdraw or reposition, they were trapped within a confined corridor. The psychological shock of encountering a concealed heavy tank, impervious to their return fire, compounded the tactical disadvantage. The KV-1 continued to fire with discipline. The gunner, Senior Sergeant Andrei Mikhailovich Yusov, was experienced and precise in his execution. His ability to engage multiple targets with minimal waste of ammunition was essential, because heavy tanks were limited in ammunition storage and the KV was isolated, without infantry support that might resupply it. Yusov's accuracy is prominently noted in Soviet documentation and was later corroborated by other witnesses. The loader and assistant crew members performed their tasks efficiently, ensuring sustained rate of fire. German tanks attempted to push past wrecks, but the blockage of the road, combined with subsequent strikes on vehicles attempting to maneuver, ensured their immobility. Several German tanks were destroyed while trying to escape into softer terrain, where their tracks bogged down. Without the support of heavy anti-tank guns, German crews could do little beyond attempt escape or continue futile return fire. In effect, a single concealed tank immobilized and destroyed an entire armored column. From a technical standpoint, the KV-1 was utilizing not only its armor and gun, but its position. The hull-down placement meant that German forces mostly saw a small, armored target while exposing the rest of the KV only partially. This tactical use of the tank's strengths demonstrates that individual engagements are not simply measures of firepower but illustrate how knowledge of terrain, preparation, and coherent planning can shape outcomes even in an army suffering structural difficulties. Kolobanov's pre-battle reconnaissance ensured that engagement distances were optimal for penetration against German armor, while German return fire was significantly reduced in effectiveness by the angle and depth of the KV's position. German attempts at suppression were unsuccessful. Anti-tank guns were not immediately available, and infantry units accompanying the tanks were pinned down or lacked heavy weaponry capable of dealing with the situation. As vehicles burned and ammunition inside them cooked off, the column became a scene of accumulating destruction. Within minutes, several tanks were rendered either destroyed or immobile. Continued fire from the KV ensured that vehicles attempting to maneuver out of the road were disabled. German forces did not yet have systematic experience facing well-positioned KV-1 tanks. Although some encounters in Belarus and the Baltic regions had exposed the vulnerability of German 37mm guns, many German crews still underestimated heavy Soviet armor, in part because such tanks were relatively few and often utilized poorly. In this engagement, the unusual combination of preparation, crew discipline, and favorable terrain created a dramatic and historically verifiable outcome. The crew inside the KV-1 functioned under intense pressure. Even though the German shells did not penetrate, the repeated impacts reverberated through the tank, creating confusion and physical strain. The sound inside heavy Soviet tanks during impact could resemble hammer strikes against metal drums, causing disorientation and headaches. The confined space, the smell of propellant fumes, and the stress of coordinating tasks under constant enemy fire placed psychological demands on every member of the crew. Although documentation typically focuses on numeric outcomes, it is important to understand that these were individuals operating within harsh physical conditions, aware that mechanical failure, ammunition depletion, or the arrival of heavier anti-tank guns could abruptly terminate their advantage. They were not invulnerable, even if their armor held. At any moment, a lucky strike, the collapse of terrain under the vehicle, or flanking fire could change the situation. Nevertheless, the KV's armor proved sufficient to absorb dozens of hits. After the battle, inspection reports recorded over 100 dents and ricochet marks on the exterior of the tank, illustrating both the intensity of the German attempts and the resilience of Soviet heavy armor. These scars on steel served as physical testimony to the battle. They also reflected a technological reality. Early war German anti-tank weaponry was insufficient against thick armor at medium range. This deficiency required German armored units to bring up heavier guns for such tasks, a process that took time and exposed units to vulnerability when encountering unexpected heavy tanks in isolated engagements. The destruction of German vehicles continued methodically. One by one, tanks were immobilized, set on fire, or left wrecked on the battlefield. The Soviet crew fired until German resistance collapsed. Eventually, the road was blocked by burning vehicles, and the KV-1 ceased firing due to the absence of viable targets or movement. The engagement lasted less than an hour but left the road clogged with metal remains that would impede German progress for days. The blocked artery forced German units to divert movement to alternate routes, costing valuable time during one of the most critical phases of the Leningrad encirclement. Although this single action did not stop the siege that would soon follow, it contributed tactically to the defense by delaying the advance at a vulnerable moment for Soviet forces. When the KV withdrew from its position, it remained operational, though heavily battered. The crew survived, and the vehicle returned to Soviet lines without the need for immediate repair beyond superficial welding and internal inspection. The after-action report submitted by Kolobanov was preserved and later cited as a significant documented instance of disproportionate defensive effectiveness. Unlike some wartime records that lack corroboration, this engagement received additional verification through battlefield examination, the inspection of the tank itself, and extracted German reports. The physical wreckage remained visible for a prolonged period, providing material evidence. The broader historical significance of this battle should be understood beyond the impressive number of destroyed vehicles. It highlights how individual crews could alter tactical circumstances in ways disproportionate to their size. It also illustrates limitations within the German armored force structure during the early invasion and demonstrates the latent capability of the Red Army that would mature later in the war. The KV-1, despite its flaws in mobility and mechanical reliability, represented a formidable defensive tool under proper conditions. Its armor thickness, gun caliber, and crew survivability proved decisive when supported by good planning and terrain knowledge. At the same time, this engagement did not change the overall operational outcome around Leningrad. The Germans continued their encirclement efforts, and the city soon entered a long and devastating siege. Yet moments like the one near Krasnogvardeysk illuminate how resistance persisted even amid strategic setbacks. These actions reveal that the Red Army's struggle in 1941 was not simply a narrative of collapse but also contained episodes of capable tactical decision-making and effective defense. The KV-1's performance, combined with disciplined crew execution, allowed a single tank to halt a mechanized thrust. Despite the historical record, this engagement has been subject to occasional doubt, largely because of the improbable numerical imbalance. Such skepticism is understandable given the frequency of embellished wartime claims. However, in this case, documents from the Soviet side were reinforced by physical evidence and consistency across multiple sources. The recorded ammunition expenditure corresponds logically with the number of destroyed targets. The tank's condition after battle aligns with repeated reports of non-penetrating German hits. German unit movements and delays on that sector corroborate the disruption caused by the ambush. While details such as exact tank models in the destroyed column vary slightly between accounts, the core facts remain consistent across credible documentation. The tank commander, Zinovy Kolobanov, did not gain widespread recognition commensurate with the scale of his achievement during his lifetime. In the immediate period after the battle, he received the Order of the Red Banner. However, his career later suffered due to unrelated political circumstances, and he did not receive further recognition that might have been expected for such a noteworthy accomplishment. His crew, particularly gunner Andrei Yusov, remained less well known to the broader public. This relative obscurity contrasts with the degree of documentation supporting their action and reflects complexities within Soviet military recognition processes. Understanding this event also requires recognizing the human dimension behind the numbers. These were not abstract vehicles, they contained individuals subjected to fear, stress, physical discomfort, and moral responsibility. They were not operating with certainty of survival. The success of the engagement was as much psychological as mechanical. The crew demonstrated trust, discipline, and cohesion. A single mistake, an exposed flank, an engine stall, or a breach in ammunition storage, could have resulted in immediate destruction. Their experience exemplifies how war forces individuals into situations where skill and chance intertwine unpredictably. Their accomplishment, therefore, is not simply a matter of statistics but of human endurance under fire. The action near Krasnogvardeysk, although a localized event within the vast scope of the Eastern Front, offers a window into the broader dynamics of armored warfare in 1941. To understand its full historical context, one must examine both the technical factors that made the KV-1 a formidable defensive asset and the strategic environment in which such isolated successes occurred. The Red Army was undergoing a catastrophic period of reorganization under the pressure of the German offensive. Large formations had been encircled, command structures had partially collapsed, and millions of soldiers were killed or captured within the first months of the invasion. Despite these losses, isolated units and individual crews occasionally mounted stiff resistance, revealing that the story of 1941 was neither a simple narrative of collapse nor one of spontaneous resilience, but rather a complex mixture of systemic weakness and localized strength. The KV-1 was originally conceived as a breakthrough tank, designed to support infantry by overwhelming fortified positions. Its armor thickness, in excess of 75 mm at many points, was considerable for its time. Prior to the war, tank designers within the Soviet Union pursued ambitious heavy armored projects, anticipating that future wars might require vehicles capable of defeating strong defensive lines. Although these designs sometimes suffered from mechanical unreliability, their core principles were forward-looking. When the war began, Soviet forces often deployed KV tanks under chaotic conditions and without proper tactical preparation. As a result, many KV-1s were lost not in decisive combat but due to breakdowns, lack of fuel, abandonment, and confusion during retreat. These circumstances contributed to the false impression among some German commanders that Soviet heavy tanks were insufficiently effective in combat. In reality, when employed correctly and maintained properly, the KV-1 demonstrated remarkable battlefield resilience. The engagement led by Kolobanov illustrated the potential of the vehicle when all conditions aligned: careful planning, advantageous terrain, and disciplined execution. It is crucial to appreciate that the KV-1 crew did not act independently of broader defensive strategy. Their success emerged within a desperate effort by Soviet forces to create delaying positions around Leningrad. The battle took place during a critical phase in which German units were seeking to enclose the city, which held both symbolic and strategic value. Leningrad was not only an industrial center producing arms and military components but also a major political and cultural hub. Its capture was envisioned within German plans as both a blow to Soviet morale and a key step in opening a northern corridor for further operations. Delaying the German advance toward the city, even by hours or days, held significance. The decision to block road approaches with heavy armor was part of a tactical method that sought to compensate for overall operational weaknesses. Soviet command could not rely on large-scale maneuver or numerical superiority, but it could create local obstacles capable of forcing German forces to expend time, ammunition, and effort. The KV-1 action served precisely such a purpose. It is also important to consider how the psychological experience of combat shaped outcomes. For German tank crews, encountering a virtually impervious enemy vehicle that remained hidden and accurate created disorientation and fear. The German armored corps at that time was accustomed to facing opponents who were often outmaneuvered or poorly coordinated. The sudden shock of receiving accurate fire from a concealed heavy tank, one that could not be penetrated by standard anti-tank shells, disrupted typical German tactical thinking. The notion of invincibility associated with blitzkrieg was eroded in such isolated confrontations. When faced with unexpected and powerful resistance, German units required adjustment time, during which their commanders had to reorganize forces, bring forward heavy artillery, or use flanking maneuvers, all actions that demanded delays inconsistent with the rapid tempo they had maintained up to that point. Thus, the KV-1 action created not only physical destruction but also psychological friction that contradicted expectations of swift victory. From the Soviet perspective, the emotional experience within the KV-1 was equally complex. Soldiers inside heavy tanks during intense engagements faced claustrophobia, immobilizing heat from engine and gun operation, and the deafening impacts of enemy shells. The metal hull transmitted vibrations and shock waves throughout the interior. Air became thick with fumes from powder charges and lubricants. Communication within the crew relied on shouted instructions or internal systems that could malfunction under stress. The gunner had to maintain composure to deliver accurate fire. The loader needed physical stamina to handle heavy ammunition repeatedly within limited space. The commander had to observe external conditions through narrow optics while coordinating the actions of the entire crew. During the action, German fire continued to strike the tank repeatedly, each impact serving as a reminder of potential failure. Even though the armor held, the crew could not be certain of continued invulnerability. A direct hit from a higher caliber weapon, the arrival of specialized anti-tank guns, or structural damage to the tracks or suspension could have transformed success into immediate danger. The crew functioned under the awareness that survival was not guaranteed despite the tank's imposing strength. After the battle, the inspection of the KV-1 revealed extensive scarring. These marks were not merely technical data but part of the lived experience of the crew. Heavy armor did not eliminate the sensation of threat. In reality, the ability to endure such an encounter required not only technological superiority in armor thickness but also emotional endurance and trust among crew members. When discussing the achievements of armored crews, historical accounts often emphasize the machine, numbers of destroyed vehicles, or tactical outcomes. Yet the human element is central. The crew of the KV-1 was not an interchangeable component of a larger war machine. It consisted of individuals whose decisions and nerves shaped the result. One must also examine the technical limitations of the KV-1 to understand why such events were rare. Although nearly impervious to most early war German anti-tank weapons, the KV-1 suffered from slow maneuverability, high fuel consumption, and mechanical vulnerability. Its heavy suspension and transmission system frequently broke down, particularly during long movements without sufficient maintenance. Soviet crews often lacked spare parts or adequate repair equipment, and the pressures of retreat in summer 1941 exacerbated these problems. Many KV tanks were abandoned due to breakdown rather than combat. Therefore, the engagement near Krasnogvardeysk, far from representing a typical use of the KV-1, reflected an optimal alignment of circumstances. The tank was prepared in advance, positioned defensively, and not required to maneuver extensively under fire. On offense or in rapid movement, the same vehicle might have been compromised by its mechanical weaknesses. Furthermore, the success of the KV-1 action demonstrates how defense can sometimes offer advantages even to numerically inferior forces. In a defensive posture, heavy armor can utilize concealment, limited arcs of enemy movement, and pre-measured firing zones. Offensive operations, by contrast, demand flexibility, mobility, and the ability to maintain supply lines. When mechanized warfare is analyzed at the operational level, one sees that heavy tanks are often more effective in static or semi-static roles than in spearhead assaults. The Soviet military later adapted to this understanding, employing heavy tanks more cautiously and selecting roles that matched their strengths. During the initial phase of the war, however, these doctrinal considerations were underdeveloped, making isolated successes like Kolobanov's action noteworthy exceptions rather than routine practice. The documentation of the engagement also offers insight into wartime record-keeping. Soviet after-action reports during the early months of the war varied in reliability due to communication breakdowns, chaotic retreat conditions, and political pressures. Many heroic actions, in either direction, were either exaggerated or underreported depending on the context. In this instance, the existence of physical battlefield evidence, combined with the visible condition of the tank, lent credibility to the reporting. The recorded ammunition expenditure aligned with the number of destroyed vehicles. Soviet officers who surveyed the site identified the wrecks and confirmed the nature of the destruction. Later, historians reviewing unit records noted consistency within German documentation that indicated disruption on that road and loss of vehicles consistent with the action. While not every detail of the engagement can be reconstructed with perfect precision, the core facts remain unchallenged by serious historians. Recognition of the crew, however, was complicated. Zinovy Kolobanov was awarded the Order of the Red Banner, a significant but not extraordinary decoration for the scale of his accomplishment. Some accounts suggest that political circumstances hindered broader acknowledgement. Kolobanov had previously served in pre-war units that became subject to scrutiny during internal military political evaluations. Whatever the exact reasons, the magnitude of his achievement did not translate into lasting personal fame during his lifetime. His gunner, Andrei Yusov, and other crew members likewise did not receive widespread recognition beyond limited circles. This disparity between extraordinary action and modest official recognition reflects the unpredictable nature of wartime honors and the influence of politics and bureaucracy within military institutions. It also illustrates how even documented achievements can fade into obscurity without sustained historical remembrance. In the decades after the war, interest in armored engagements increased among historians, military analysts, and enthusiasts. As studies of tank warfare expanded, researchers began to highlight examples of asymmetric outcomes in which individual units or machines achieved disproportionate effects. Kolobanov's engagement emerged in this context as a rare case where the numbers were not merely anecdotal but supported by documentation. Unlike many stories that circulated without corroboration, this incident withstood scrutiny. The presence of corroborative physical evidence, independent reports, and consistent archival data placed it among the most reliable single-tank actions of the war. This does not diminish the possibility that other extraordinary actions occurred without documentation, rather, it emphasizes the importance of methodological rigor in historical evaluation. The strategic impact of the engagement must not be overstated. The battle did not prevent the encirclement of Leningrad. The siege that followed lasted nearly 900 days and resulted in immense civilian suffering, starvation, and death. The KV-1 action was a tactical delay, not a turning point. Yet its importance lies not only in tactical consequence but in the demonstration of how war consists of countless individual decisions, actions, and moments. Some of these moments contribute to delaying enemy movements, enabling defensive preparations, or buying time for civilians to be evacuated. In this case, the delay forced German units to reconsider their route and expend time. Such delays accumulate, and while they cannot reverse grand strategic defeat, they reveal how war is shaped by many small impediments rather than only by decisive battles. The KV-1 engagement near Krasnogvardeysk also highlights the evolution of German anti-tank doctrine. After encountering heavy Soviet tanks, German formations increasingly integrated larger caliber anti-tank guns, such as the 50mm Pak-38 and later the more formidable 75mm Pak-40. They used artillery and air power to deal with heavy armor. These adjustments were not solely responses to this specific event but emerged from a growing recognition of Soviet heavy armor's resilience. The experience gained by German forces in confronting tanks like the KV-1 contributed indirectly to later improvements in their approach to armored warfare. Thus, one isolated battle becomes part of a broader pattern of adaptation and learning, shaping the evolution of techniques, weapons, and doctrine. With time, as veterans aged and personal memories faded, the historical significance of such actions became dependent on careful documentation and preservation of records. The Soviet Union erected memorials at various sites, but the process of memory formation was selective, shaped by political and cultural priorities. Many individuals who demonstrated bravery remained largely unknown, while others received disproportionate attention due to narrative needs. In the case of Kolobanov and his crew, recognition remained modest. However, within military and scholarly circles, their achievement gained respect as more detailed studies of armored engagements emerged. The lack of widespread public fame does not diminish the value of their action. Rather, it underscores the importance of historical integrity, ensuring that individuals are remembered not according to propaganda needs but according to documented contribution. This perspective also emphasizes the ethical responsibility of historians and writers to convey wartime events with honesty, avoiding unnecessary embellishment. War provides fertile ground for myth-making, often driven by the emotional need to assign meaning to suffering and sacrifice. Yet to honor those who endured war authentically, one must resist the impulse to exaggerate. The true story of the KV-1 action requires no embellishment. Its facts are compelling in their own right. A single tank, properly positioned and crewed with discipline, halted a mechanized column, destroyed 22 tanks, survived despite significant enemy attention, and delayed an advance during a critical phase of the invasion. These facts alone illustrate the unpredictable and contingent nature of war. The lesson derived from the engagement also concerns the limitations of technological superiority. Heavy armor provided significant advantage in specific conditions, but it did not produce guaranteed outcomes. The crew's planning and tactical execution were essential. If the KV-1 had been placed in a different position, if the Germans had arrived with heavier guns, if mechanical failure had occurred, or if the column had approached more cautiously, the outcome might have been different. Warfare is shaped by uncertainty. Technology interacts with human decision, terrain, psychology, and chance. The significance of this battle therefore lies not simply in the capabilities of a tank but in the interplay of multiple factors under stress. In the post-war period, the industrial legacy of Leningrad contributed to the continued development of Soviet armored design. The city, under siege and suffering greatly, nevertheless maintained production where possible. After the war, design bureaus continued to evolve heavy tanks toward greater balance between protection, firepower, and mobility. Lessons learned from early war encounters informed the reconsideration of armor distribution, internal layout, and mechanical reliability. The heavy tank would eventually be replaced by more versatile designs with improved engines and transmissions. While the KV-1 was eventually overshadowed by later designs such as the IS series, its role in the early defense of the Soviet Union was foundational. The legacy of the KV-1 includes not only battlefield accomplishments but also the development of Soviet armored doctrine. However, historical evaluation must remain careful not to sanitize the harshness of war. The same conflict that produced acts of tactical excellence also produced immense suffering and brutality. The siege of Leningrad that followed the defensive battles claimed lives far beyond the number lost in any armored engagement. The civilians trapped within the city endured hunger, cold, and bombardment. Within this broader context, the KV-1 action can be seen not as an isolated heroic episode but as one element of a desperate struggle to slow an advancing enemy. Acts of resistance, like that of Kolobanov's crew, formed part of the complex structure of endurance that ultimately contributed to the survival of the city despite horrific losses. The story of the KV-1 at Krasnogvardeysk therefore serves as a reminder that wartime history must honor both the extraordinary and the tragic dimensions of conflict. Individual accomplishments matter because they reflect the determination, skill, and suffering of those who served. Yet they cannot be separated from the larger realities of war. When preserving history, one must maintain this balance, acknowledging success without obscuring sacrifice. It is only through such balance that historical truth can retain both accuracy and moral significance. To this day, the remains of the battlefield and its memorials stand as physical evidence of what occurred. Modern historians, through archival research, battlefield archaeology, and analysis of contemporary reports, continue to confirm the validity of the account. The tank, crew, and destroyed vehicles remain part of a documented historical record. Veterans and their families have sometimes revisited such sites, not to glorify war but to remember those who endured it. The KV-1 action near Krasnogvardeysk remains a testament to the reality that in war, individual decisions and preparations can shape the course of events in unexpected ways. The technical resilience of a machine, the discipline of a crew, the foresight of a commander, and the circumstances of terrain together demonstrated the potential for a single localized act to hold meaning far greater than its scale might suggest. Thus the event remains historically significant not as a myth or exaggerated tale but as an authentic example of how carefully applied tactics and courage under fire can produce results that resonate across decades. In preserving this story faithfully, without embellishment, one honors not only the crew who survived the battle but also the many who endured the war and did not survive to see its end. To record their experiences truthfully is a responsibility owed to them and to history itself.